Good afternoon, everyone. I am Catherine Brookman, Associate Director, Knowledge Transfer and Exchange, and on behalf of Dr. Jack Callahan, Director of the Center of Research Expertise for the Prevention of Musculoskeletal Disorders, or CRE-MSD as we are more commonly known, we'd like to thank you for joining us today for this free webinar, MSD Prevention and Ultra-Wide Computer Displays for Office Work. We are grateful to the Ministry of Labor, Immigration, Training and Skills Development for our funding, which supports the delivery of these webinars, and to our presenters who provide their expertise. We ask that you keep yourself muted for the duration of the webinar as a courtesy to the presenter and all the participants. The format of today's webinar is as follows. The presentation will be given, after which time we will have 10 to 15 minutes for a question and answer period with our presenter. During the question and answer period, we ask that you type your questions into the chat box. The chat box can be pulled up on your screen by selecting the chat icon in the control panel that appears near the bottom of your screen. I will relay these questions to the presenter or a similar question should we have duplicate themes. Should you have a pressing question or issue, such as a technology glitch that cannot wait until the end of the presentation, please type this into the chat box and we will do our best to address it right away. This webinar is being recorded, with the recording being made available to you on our website along with the presenter slides shortly after today's webinar. You will also be sent a link to an evaluation. Please fill this out as it will assist us in the future delivery of our webinars. Thank you so much for joining us today, and remember to watch the CRE-MSD website and the MSD prevention site for other webinars within this theme of remote work resources and events. Now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our presenter, Dr. Kaitlin Gallagher. Dr. Kaitlin Gallagher is an Associate Professor of Exercise Science at the University of Arkansas. She completed her undergraduate degree and PhD degree at the University of Waterloo, where her work concentrated on prolonged standing-induced low back pain. Dr. Gallagher currently researches the influence of occupational work on neck and low back pain. The switch towards standing work, sit-stand desks, and mobile computing is an exciting time in changing the current workplace setup. However, many unknown injury risks can result from these changes. Kaitlin uses biomechanical data collection techniques, 3D motion capture, electromyography, and force platforms to assess people's posture, muscle activity, and movement due to these new workplace setups. Now it's my pleasure to hand this over to Kaitlin.
Thank you, Catherine, for that introduction. So, as Catherine said, I am currently an associate professor at the University of Arkansas, but she did mention my connection to Waterloo and to Canada, that I finished my undergraduate degree in the co-op program at the University of Waterloo in kinesiology, and then continued on to do my PhD in kinesiology as well. And I started my assistant professor position here at the University of Arkansas in January 2015. So I've been here for just over 8 years. And for many of you, you may have no idea where Arkansas is, and that's okay. I didn't know where Arkansas is before I applied for this job. Really, so we're in the northwest corner. So the pin is where Waterloo is, and the northwest corner of Arkansas is where the green dot is. But you know, in terms of my connection back to Waterloo and CRE-MSD, I have a lot to be thankful for that. I just wanted to touch on that. that a lot of my first major grants came from applying to CRE-MSD. So here's a sample of 3 different papers that we had done, and also how I started really looking at the neck. You can see me on the right. I won't date this picture, but Jack Callahan is in the back there, and you can see that we're looking at how tablets are being used in association with a computer monitor. And I started to really look at more than just the low back. We were looking at different parts there. So I'm really grateful. And I was just thinking as well, I think my very first co-op job where I worked for Jack was also funded on a CRE-MSD project. So I'm very happy and thankful to give back to CRE-MSD today. So what are we going to talk about? We're going to review the literature on multiple screen configurations, because before we can really talk about the new advances, we should go back to people have been using large displays, but they've just been doing it with multiple screen configurations. So what do we know about that? We're going to define ultra-wide and curved display characteristics if you are new to this space. We'll talk about why people are choosing ultra-wide displays. Then we'll review some initial performance and usability metrics, and then I'll provide some results for studies we have done here. And then we'll summarize and provide some take-home messages. Okay, so I know many of you, when you're looking at your screen right now, you're thinking about your screens at home. You're a person who is responsible for setting up people's offices. There are so many different configurations that people can put multiple screens in. So we have an example of a portrait. We have something split on somebody if they were sitting in the middle. We have a primary, secondary. We have a laptop that is hooked up to a screen. They're being placed on different books. So even though in research, we're having some very specific configurations in the field, what people are going to do is very dependent on a lot of different factors. And when it comes to multiple monitors, even though these headlines are older, we can see that there's just a lot of people on, do you use multiple monitors? Do you not? And now there would be, do you use ultra wide monitor versus 2 dual monitors? So there's always a lot of discussion, and people will go back and forth on this. So where I originally started when I was looking at this is a systematic review that we did, and this was published in Human Factors. And it was looking at, does using multiple computer monitors for office tasks affect user experience? And so what we found was there were 18 articles that assessed health and productivity outcomes when using multiple monitors, and only 6 had health-related outcomes. So that would be something looking at electromyography, pain development. And on this slide, this is one of the main take-home messages that we got from that systematic review of papers that we found, is there were strong evidence that people liked dual monitors. So implementing them was in line with users' preferences. But one of the potential issues was increased neck rotation, so that implementing multiple monitors may result in non-neutral neck posture. So this would be twisting to the right or to the left. And so this should be taken in consideration when installing these new configurations or training users. Having that more screen compared to a single monitor in a controlled study demonstrated that multiple monitors may increase task efficiency with decreased desktop interaction. So that includes moving windows, clicking on screens, scrolling. But then there was limited or mixed or insufficient outcomes, that there was really time saving. So if you were going to use it from a cost benefit analysis, that you were saving time, there wasn't really much out there from the field to show that you were going to actually save time. Neck muscle activity was very mixed. Neck muscles are very difficult to track with electromyography, and it really depended on what people were doing. And there wasn't much that came out with eye muscle activity or eye strain as well. But overwhelming, that implementing and having more screen space was something that people preferred. But one of the other things that I was looking at is when I was reading a lot of these papers, they were using fairly small screens. And I will, if you could see me, I would put small screens into quotations. Obviously, small screens is relative to the time that the study is being talked. So there could be something that was done in 2010, and they were like, we are doing a really large screen, and it's a 27-inch screen. And that is much bigger than the screens people are typically using. So what we found was that there was a lot more research so that's about 2007, that was looking at what they defined as large displays, being about 20-inch diagonals or 25-inch diagonals. But then we can see as time goes on, and this even think about it, is that the size of the monitors being used in these studies to assess dual displays was actually decreasing over time, that the largest size we were seeing was 20 inches for a flat panel. But this is opposite to what purchasing trends have shown. Purchasing trends have shown that the 22, 23, or 25-inch monitors are more what people are purchasing. So our research was lagging behind what market changes were. Even taking into account that research can take time to publish, we weren't using these larger monitors in our study. And so that was concerning in terms of where we are and what recommendations we could make, or to make sure that these larger monitors weren't inducing any additional changes. Another area that's coming in are these curved and ultra-wide displays, which is what the focus of our talk will be. And so in 2019, the curved monitors had a 45% year-over-year growth in the second quarter of 2019. And so many of these monitors are what are defined as being ultra-wide. So as opposed to a 16:9 or 16:10 ratio, we see these monitors have a 21:9 or even a 32:9 ratio. So they are able to get much wider without having the same increase in height. And just for context, there are 16:9 or 16:10 curved monitors that do exist, and you will see people using them. But what we see in the office setting that is really coming in is these ultra wide monitors going through. So that's mainly what we're going to focus on. But I do want to point out that curved monitors exist in other sizes and aspect ratios as well. So the initial work that we see with curved monitors and curved displays came from Microsoft in 2003. And so this is an example of a user working on what they called the D# display. And I believe this is a 45-inch diagonal. It is curved. And they were comparing it to what at the time was a popular size, which was a 15-inch, like, I don't know if it was a flat panel or a CRT. And what they found was that, or it was an LCD. So what they found was that their task that they had, which took about their task that they had, was faster when someone used a large display. So that was the D#. And it may seem like this is not a big difference, but these were skilled users. So to see such a decrease, they said, was a big deal from what they would typically see. They also found that people were moving windows around more, and there were 300 more window events on a small display. So from an organizational perspective, going through. So from that. So just for some context about why curved ultra-wide and not just ultra-wide, you may see on the market that there are monitors that are advertised as being ultra-wide, but are still flat panel. You don't see a lot of these. But one of the reasons that we do curve is it's similar to our field of vision, and we see less distortion that occurs at the edges. It also means that the viewing distance can be more consistent around the curve instead of the viewing distance starting to increase when you go to the edges of the display. And so this is very similar to what we see depending on how people want to set up their dual monitors. We can have people who have things that are at an angle, maybe with 165 degrees in between, or we can have 180 degrees like you see on the right. And what the research shows is that when you have the situation on the right, is people will shorten the horizontal distance to the screen by bending their trunk forward. So especially as things get wider, they will move forward because the preferred distance that they may have in the center of the monitor increases to the side. So having the curve is very similar to what we would see with multiple monitors that are angled in. Another definition that may come out is with curvature radius. So these monitors aren't all going to have the same curve, but you will see it defined as some different numbers. And the curvature radius can be an example of 1800R, 3800R, etc. And that has to do with the R is instead of having the units of millimeters. So on the right, what you will see is that a monitor that has a curvature of 1800R is what it would be on the circumference of a circle that has a radius of 1800 millimeters. So we can see as the radius of this monitor starts to increase from 3 to 2 to 1, the curve becomes less exaggerated going in. So depending on the size of the monitor, it's going to have a different curvature coming in. The early monitors, it's actually really hard to find what the curvature is and what the implications of this curvature are, but that is something that may come up in terms of looking at some differences between two different monitors, is what their curvature is. Okay, so, yes, there is these ultra-wide displays that have come out, but what's the difference between purchasing one, a 2 flat panel displays, maybe, and I chose 24 inches because that's one of the most popular sizes right now to purchase for dual monitors. Or you could purchase a 34-inch ultra-wide curved display. And these monitors, 34 inches is usually the smallest you're going to see in a curved ultra-wide, but there's 38, 40, and up to 49 inches depending on the brand. So when it comes to screen width, you actually have more width with 2 flat panel displays than you would a 34-inch display. As this goes up to a 38 or to a 40, this would change. But so we see that the width for 2 flat panel 24 inches is about 108 centimeters. It's 80 centimeters with a 34-inch curved. You do get more height though, about 5 centimeters. So you're looking at about 2 inches change in height there. So that is something different. But one of the biggest things that I've seen in my institution really came down to cost when it came to this. They had to replace a bunch of older monitors. And I think when they looked at it, they were like, well, we can purchase one ultra wide monitor or we can purchase 2 flat panels, and let's look at the price. So I got these off of a website. They're in Canadian dollars. I got these yesterday. So if you purchased, and there's many models, so these prices could be different, but if you purchased 2 flat panel 24-inch displays at $350 Canadian, it was going to come out to about $700. For a particular ultra wide that didn't have a lot of bells and whistles, it came out to $620 from there. So if someone is strictly looking at things from a cost perspective, yes, you're giving up a little bit of the width. Does that really matter? From a purchasing perspective, someone may not look at it like that, and they may be like, well, this option is cheaper. This is what we are going to go with. Now, these monitors, like a lot of them can go and be very expensive. You can get them up to $1,800 depending on the quality, the other features that you're looking for. So there's a huge range in these displays like we would see in some other ways. One of the things that I'm going to keep coming back to, though, is as monitors have changed over the years, and even just in the last 5 years, one of the things that differs greatly between them is their brightness. So what we see as candelas per meter squared, a higher number means that it has a higher brightness capability. So for the flat panels that are older models, we would see them be about 250 versus 300 for the 34-inch. And so one of the things that we see now with monitors is that they can be a lot brighter without having having less energy consumption than they used to. So a lot of these monitors are coming to be a lot brighter, and we're going to come back to that on what it means for people. So one of the initial studies that I had done was just to compare, how are all of these different configurations there for the curved ultra wide versus a lot of the other different options that we have. So people could have 2 dual monitors centered on them. They could use a laptop as a second screen. They could have a primary versus a secondary. They can have a dual 24-inch primary versus one that was portrait, which is very common in some areas and some work that people are looking at. So we first get in there, we get into the lab, and we start doing our study, and we have consistent viewing distance for all of these, and people could not stand how close the ultra wide display was that we were using. So it was a 34-inch, and initial feedback was like, it's too close, we can't work at it like this. And so we ended up moving it back, which I do regret doing in hindsight, but that came a lot of questions of, are the actual places that people want to place these monitors different between them. And so that is something that has come up in a lot of the other space as well, especially when looking at furniture, is how are these monitors going to be placed? How do people want to position them? Going through there. The other thing to really think about when you're looking at research, especially if you want to know about neck rotation angles, you want to know about neck biomechanics in general when they're using it, is task really influences what the outcomes are. So if you have a task where people are concentrating on the center of the display and they're not testing the outer limits, so the lateral sides as well, then you may see that there's not that much change in neck biomechanics, but there are a lot of different tasks that bring people around the screen that we can test. So the most common tasks done by a task analysis by Stringfellow that we find is people want to use dual displays for comparison tasks, for referencing tasks, when they have to drag and drop things, when they want to copy and paste, and then if they want to monitor info. So we made sure to look at a variety of different tasks that people were using so that we could see how do those dual monitors compare to the ultrawides. So from a interaction with the screen, so similar to what we wanted to see that when they were doing the original D-Sharp display, was we found that in the tasks that involved copying and pasting and monitoring information, as we would expect, a wider display, so with the ultrawide, had a decreased number of clicks for what they had to do to complete the task and a decreased number of scrolls. In portrait displays, so for copying and pasting, this task had a really large amount of folders that were in a file. And so they could have it on the right-hand side. They would be able to see anything. They didn't have to scroll around. There wasn't as much clicking to change windows. So we found that those were good for there. They performed similarly in terms of interactions versus the single. Whereas some of the other setups that we had either with the laptop or the two different dual displays, just in terms of how they had to interact with the screen to move around windows, was different. With monitoring information, we also see that when you're just monitoring things going through, you have stuff on the left and the right side. There were still a decreased number of clicks for the task that they had to do and decreased number of scrolls. And it wasn't different when you were looking at the other displays, but using a laptop as a second display drastically increased the amount of clicks that people had to use. So people using their laptop as a second display had more scrolls and more clicks going through. And so that was, I think, a 15-inch diagonal monitor. In terms of generally what people liked it, at first, people really didn't like the ultra-wide display. They said it was too close. We moved it back, and people had at least in line with what we saw with a dual monitor or a second monitor. And so the scores here, the maximum is 77. And so the closer you are to 77, the more satisfied the user was when they used the task. And they used it for an hour on 6 separate days. And so they're slightly more satisfied with those displays, that they seem to like the increase in horizontal space, whether it came from using the portrait or the two different types of second, whereas the laptop was the one that they really didn't like for the tasks that we were doing. So it was on par with what we would see with other dual displays. Some observations as these monitors have gotten bigger. So even if we want to think of flat panel monitors that have gotten bigger, when people try to put them into portrait mode, which is something when I walk around our office here because of the number of spreadsheets people are using, or if you have somebody who's using a lot of toolbars, is people will still want to have a monitor in portrait, or they're reading documents like a PDF. But as monitors have gotten larger, we can see that the screen actually goes above what you would have, say, on this one to the left. So it's up higher, so people would potentially have more neck extension, and this just has to do with the size. You can't lower it anymore. So larger displays are not really well suited for these portrait displays, depending on how you have your screen set up. And I've seen some people try to keep even their very large monitors, they really want them in portrait. So it's something to really look at and think about as screens are getting larger, and what the user is typically doing versus what they can do. Okay, so we looked at that at first. We were like, oh, how are people wanting to position these displays? And it came back on why do they want to push these displays back further? So in October 2021, I gave a talk to the Association of Canadian Ergonomists for the Ontario region. It was virtual as well, just sort of talking about the initial research and the initial space that we had. And one person came up and they said, one of the things is I just decreased my brightness of my display and I was able to move it closer. And I thought, huh, let's take a look at how the brightness compares between these different displays and what it means for people and how they want to display it. So we ended up comparing 3 different monitors, just a single ultra wide or a single flat panel of 24 inches, a 34-inch ultra wide, and then a 40-inch ultra wide from there. So this was done just after the pandemic. Supply chain was not our friend in terms of getting things, but these ones represented more of still of what you would see. Again, the largest was going to be like a 49-inch was the only one that was really higher to this. From a display area standpoint, we can see them increasing, both increasing in width and then not as much from height from there, but their brightnesses were different. So our original 24-inch flat panel on the left didn't have as high of a brightness ability as our ones on the right, as our ultra wides. And so that was something that we have to control for. And research studies will talk a lot about controlling for certain parameters of the monitor, but they don't always talk about controlling for the brightness, or at least don't talk about what the brightness was in their studies. They may talk about the room brightness, they may talk about some of the other contrast features, but being able to standardize this was necessary as we moved forward to see, was it just because it was so bright that people wanted to move it back, or is there something about the curved nature of the display? So we did a lab study that had 21 participants, and they were graduate assistants. So these are people whose job for the university relates to doing research for the most part, or a lot of computer-based tasks. They were between the ages of 18 to 35 and had normal or corrected to normal vision with contacts. And so I'm going to go through, these were the 3 displays that we did, and I'm going to show just what our study was in terms of getting people used to these displays. Because another thing was that some people had dual monitors that came in, but a lot of people hadn't, or I think all of them had never used an ultra wide display before. So we had to get them familiar with it so that they could get an idea. So we used a 3D motion capture system to not only track their body position, but to track everything in the space. So that included the chair, the desk that they were on, and the screen itself. They then became familiar with 2 types of tasks. One was finding amongst strings of nonsense words where there was a space, they had to find the same letter on both sides. And then another one was looking at paragraphs of information, and they had to find the word nature, and the word nature was overly expressed so that they had to read through and find it there. So they were made familiar with the tasks. And then we started looking at the first display. So from the research, what it says is that if you can familiarize people with the different positions that a monitor could go into, so instead of just giving them a monitor and saying, what position would you want it in, and going through give them some options on what there could be and let them use it and see what they are. So that's what we ended up doing, was we allowed them to look at some standard conditions of how the monitor was placed. So we looked at 3 different horizontal conditions from 60 to 80 centimeters. We looked at 3 different display heights. So this was looking at the center of the screen to the work surface. And then we looked at 2 different tilts. And so when you combine all of these things together, that's 18 different standard conditions. And what they did was they did the task of finding amongst nonsense words where there was a space and the letter was the same side, or letter was the same on each side. They had to do that for 9 regions of the display. So they went from the center, and then they went all the way through the different 9 regions, and then went back to the center, and then we would change the positioning. And so that took about 45 minutes. And so they had 18 different configurations, and they were told to really think about what they liked and what they didn't like about that particular conditions for that particular display. And those were randomized in terms of what they did. The next thing that they did was for 9 minutes, they used the display to find the word search task. And that word search task was over 3 different portions of the display. It was in the center, then it was on the left, and then they would go to the right. And so they would pick a position, and then every 3 minutes, we would ask them if they wanted to change the position. So one thing that has been found is that instead of people wanting to move a display closer, they will lean their trunk forward. And so what we told them was that their back had to stay against the chair. But if they thought that they needed to lean forward, what it meant was they actually would have to move the display closer to them. So they would do that. So they picked, worked for 3 minutes, picked again, worked for 3 minutes, did their last 3 minutes. And then whatever their last position was what we chose as their user preferred position. And so 9 minutes after about that, when you have people do that in the research, between 9 and 12 people are usually at what they would keep using for that particular time that they are in the lab. So then they did this for the next 3 displays. So how did we have the workstation set up? So the first thing was we didn't want desk depth to be a constraint. That is something that in the field research that has looked at how people use these ultra-wide displays is a potential concern, is that if you have a 24-inch desk depth, people may want to move the monitor back more, but they can't. And if they don't have another way to artificially increase the horizontal distance, then maybe it's closer than they want it. It was also height adjusted to each participant. Their chair was adjusted to the individuals, and we had a locked backrest. And so they chose a position at the desk at the very beginning of the study, and it was maintained for the entire study. And like I said, they had to have their back interacting with the backrest. So if we found them trying to lean forward, that was something that we curbed from there. One of the discussions that we had was, do we use a display arm for these so that there is, a lot of freedom in terms of, especially from a vertical perspective and how we would do this. But when we looked at some of our survey respondents on how people were using these displays, for the one group that we were looking at, only 26% of survey respondents used display arms at work. So we thought that it would be more common that people were using the usual bases with these displays. And when I look around our offices, there's very few people who are using displays. It may differ on where you're working in terms of what is standard, but so we decided to keep them on the bases. And then last, but probably most importantly from the monitors, is the display brightness was standardized and calibrated to 120 candelas per meter squared. And so as we were looking at this, our 24-inch flat panel didn't need to be changed that much. Our 34-inch flat panel needed to be changed a little bit more, but the default brightness for a 40-inch started at about 200, and it was bright. And there are also a lot of other features on there that change depending on motion, there's dynamic changes, and it was a lot. So we turned all of that off and made sure that before we started. The room was set at about 400 lux for what's happening at the table height. That was just what we could get it at. So 500 is what you may have as being, ideal. But we thought it was pretty good in terms of what we have seen in other places. So I'm just going to present some of the basic outcomes that we found from that work. So we're going to look at horizontal distance, we're going to look at gaze angle, and then neck twist range of motion. So we compared these between display sizes, and we also made sure in our statistical analysis that people could control display angle and they could control display height. So we just wanted to make sure that that wasn't the reason that we were seeing differences, rather it was the actual displays. Okay, unsurprising is that neck rotation ranges increased for the larger displays. So when they were using it in this free task that brought them from the center to the left to the right of the display, we saw neck rotation range of motion increase from about 22 degrees to 32 with the 34-inch to 36 or 37 for the 40-inch. So we see increased range of motion. This is no different than what we would see if we had dual displays as well, but that there was this increase, and it was still statistically different between the 34-inch to the 40-inch, even though it's not as great. So again, this is what we expected. The horizontal viewing distance was something we thought people wanted to do if these screens were really curvature of them was really causing people an issue, that we would see differences. And there was only a small increase in horizontal viewing distance. It wasn't, we went from about 67 centimeters to 68 centimeters to 70 centimeters, so 71. So you're seeing about a 2 to 3 centimeter increase for each size of display as you go up. And these are in line with viewing distances of what we've seen. And other work done in 2010 that was looking at flat panel displays going from 19 inches to 24 inches to 27 inches also saw that there were minor changes in horizontal viewing distance. And when you use dual displays, there's also not that much of a change in viewing distance between two 19-inch monitors and a single 19-inch monitor. So what they concluded was that horizontal viewing distance, so from the person to the display, is likely more dictated by the height of the display rather than the width. And that seems to be similar to us here. So yes, there are changes, but it's not with the same magnitude that we would see with the size increase from what you would expect. So all is in line with what we typically see. But one of the things that when we talked to the furniture companies that they were thinking about was the constraints on the actual desk. Well, okay, here are these horizontal viewing distances, but what does it mean in terms of where they would place it on their desk? And so what we did was we had, say, our hypothetical person who's on the left. We measured the distance from the front of the display or front of the desk, so your edge, if for what you're sitting in from the edge, all the way to where the back of the display, where the back of the stand would go to. So not where the display was, where the stand would go to. And what we found was that preferred horizontal distances chosen by the participants could result in the back of a display stand exceeding a 24-inch desk depth. So we chose to compare it to 24 inches into 30 inches. 24 inches is a very common desk depth that is sold. 30 inches or 29 inches is the next one up that you will see. And so what we found was that for the 24-inch display, 14 didn't exceed that 24-inch depth, whereas 5 did, and it starts to increase as we go to the 40-inch display. So even though we don't see as much of the horizontal distance to the display itself, the stands on ultra-wide displays, especially as they get large, are big and they are heavy. So a 40-inch ultra-wide display that we were using was 14 kilograms versus the 24-inch is about 5 going from there. So these stands are big. And so they would exceed as they would go through. We don't see as many exceeding that 30-inch mark as well. So this was a concern in some of the field work that had been done where they were seeing how people wanted to display these. They couldn't necessarily get them where they wanted to because of desk constraints. Lastly, what we have is gaze angle. So we see here that there wasn't any difference in gaze angle. So again, these people weren't able to compare back to what they did in a different task. It's pretty even across the different displays at about 12. That's on the higher end maybe of what you would want a gaze angle to be. But this is also what has been found in other work in labs where that are looking at. It is larger than what has been seen is recommended for dual monitors, but this one study that is based off of recommendations for dual monitors that says you should have less of a gaze angle, in their task that they did, they really forced people to use the lateral edges of the display. So you can imagine if you are looking towards the lateral edge of a display for a couple minutes, you're going to have a lot of neck rotation. If you have a large gaze angle, you potentially will have more neck flexion, and so you may be in more awkward postures. And so they recommended having a more shallow gaze angle if you had dual displays. So even though we brought people around, they started in the middle and had to find the nature task, and then they went to the left and worked there, and then they went to the right and worked there. People still weren't, they were still, I think, organizing it based off of the center potentially. And so this is where, again, tasks are so important when going through things. we were doing our initial study for this, and we do have them going through multiple areas of the displays. We'll talk about some issues that we would see and what their neck positions were in each of those standard positions, so what the extremes would be. But that's one of the things, again, when comparing is what did they have people doing? So we still just had people going through the center of the display and not challenging them into the bottom left, bottom right, high left, high right. So that could be one of the reasons why they picked that gaze angle that they did. Okay, but like I said, we can have people going into a variety of different tasks. So with the most commonly tasks that people will see with dual monitors, if we had an ultra-wide monitor, say for monitoring info, and somebody is monitoring something that is positioned in the bottom left, depending on how they have their windows organized, it's going to create a different neck angle than someone who organizes their windows differently. And that is irrespective of it is for dual or it is for ultra-wide, is that window placement is a huge factor in how people are going to look at their displays, what their neck angles are going to be. So separate, you can set something up and you can be very happy with what it is for a person, but if they have poor window management techniques, they may be in postures that you don't want them to be in just because of these monitors now being so wide, whether it's dual or whether it's ultra wide. This is how our results compared to a field study. So this is where they gave people 34-inch monitors to use in the field. I think it was for 4 weeks, and compared how people positioned them. So ours, most of our results are in line with what they ended up finding, just with less range for what they were doing. So viewing distances were typically around 70 for the 34-inch. The gaze angle was a little bit more for what we were looking at, so 13 versus 10. The display height was the exact same. The screen tilt angle was something that came out. That was the only thing that was different, that we had people, they tilted it to about 10 degrees, whereas they had people tilting it in the field to positive 15, so that would be tilted forward versus negative 12. So that's why some of the differences come in. So the last things that we'll kind of cover are, what do people say about these? So these were, we asked people just, what did they prefer? And to take these preference with a grain of salt, because typically people with preference are going to anchor to what they're currently using. So most people were using dual displays, so they have the larger displays, but that's just something to keep in context. So on this initial comparison, was 57% of people liked the display, the 34-inch display. And they said they like wide monitors, but the 40-inch one was just too wide. And that came up quite a bit, that the 40-inch was way too much screen. And you kind of hear words like being engulfed. You feel immersed, which is one of the things that curved monitors tout, that it's a very immersive experience because of the curve. But they thought the 40-inch was too much for those people. They also thought that there was too much head movement, so that they liked the 34-inch because it's big enough, but you didn't have to move your head around as much, which can be a pro and a con depending on what you think of with static postures in the middle, but that there was too much head movement for the 40 inches. But some people did like the 40-inch display. They either thought that there was not a big difference, they liked it, but they had to move it further away than they thought. And this person was the person who moved it the furthest away for what people were using. But then when they thought about it, these people said, like, well, if I'm working, I want the most room possible, so I would take the 40-inch. And that came up a couple times as well, not thinking from a posture perspective, but thinking from a performance perspective. And then someone was like, I just kind of like this 24-inch monitor. I don't have to move my head as much. The other ones from there. So that was in our lab. But one of the reasons that I knew so much about these ultra-wide displays that were coming in was because our university was purchasing a lot of them. So specifically in my unit. And so I wanted to see how people are using these across campus. So we just did an initial survey of ultra-wide display usage. And the majority of our respondents were staff members. And we had some faculty. These are graduate assistants. Again, these are people who are working. They're not just graduate students who are going here, who are just working in an office setting for more than 50% of their day. So what we found was 23% of these users used an ultra-wide display at work. So 28% of our staff respondents and 12% of our faculty respondents. And here are some themes that came out. They talked a lot about window arrangement, screen characteristics, specific tasks, workstation considerations, discomfort, this could be positive or negative, and the learning curve involved with them. So I'm not going to read through all of these, but I have them so that when you get the PowerPoint, it's talking about window arrangement. So dual screens allow for more windows to be up at a time. But some people even commented that they did like it, that they didn't have to put something over 2 screens. So even though you now have these flat panel screens that are smaller but have very small bevels, the bevel is still there in the center if someone wants to stretch, say, a spreadsheet over a large area or scan something over a large area. So it allows for their and going through that you don't have to move as much for that. The type of work people said they liked using was mainly for spreadsheets. Finance came up a lot for there, something that has a lot of columns. But a potential issue that someone talked about when it came up for work is that it was nice to have a split screen for design work or other jobs for alternating, but it was less ideal for focused work. So if you think of something like when I go to work on some of these screens and I'm writing a Word document, I don't necessarily need that Word document spread over an entire screen. So it needs to be maybe in a more focused area, but what does that mean for the peripheral on the side? And so time and time again, we come back to window management. And I'm not going to sit there and say that I am the best person at window management. Sometimes I get stuck in something, and vice versa. It hasn't always been easy to manage multiple windows on these displays, especially just in native Windows or in and Macs may have certain hotkeys that you can use, but I still have a third-party one that I have installed in my Mac. So Dell, for example, has always had this display manager that comes with the display itself that then needs to be downloaded. And so traditionally, we could think of splitting stuff in half, but with how wide these monitors are, splitting something into tertiles where you have a focus in the middle and then can use the left or the right like you would a dual display is going to be more important. I still don't think Windows 10 has anything that we can find that allow for that, but this is a screenshot of Windows 11, and apparently Windows 11 has a little bit more option in terms of getting the display or getting the monitor where you want it to be, or window where you want it to be from there. This still requires people to use it, and that's always going to be a potential issue. So things people talked about, again, the size, they talked about it being too big. That's usually the comment that you're going to get. Is really bright, but some people liked the resolution of it, especially if they were going from maybe a very much older monitor to a newer one. Workstation consideration, so people talked about the large stands. I have seen people try to set up 3 ultra-wide monitors beside each other, and it kind of looks like they're in a mission control, and I'm like, I know what kind of work you do, and you probably don't need that many. From there, there's potential issues with sit-stand desks, and when I think about how heavy these displays are, especially with manual sit-stand desks, it's a lot. With the display stands, the displays themselves are fairly light, but going through there. And discomfort is kind of all over the place. Some people said that you get fatigued quicker. That could depend on brightness. Some people said I'm not having any issues. And then one person talked about the second monitor, and that some people just use their second monitor for communication to limit how much head they're turning, but you don't have that with just a single display. And then finally, there is a learning curve. So when people first see these, they'll be like, whoa, these are so big. But it can take a lot to use to, and I can attest for myself, they do take a lot to get used to, and then I don't think about it anymore. So that was a comment that some people had. So I'll wrap up with some potential concerns that would have is while you may have more window configuration options, there's less hardware option configuration for functionality and freedom with one ultra-wide display. So an example is in my lab is we would have 2 monitors potentially for display. And what we would do is we would turn one around so either our participant could see what was happening or when we were setting up our lab could see it. We also see this with advisors who have to show specific students documents but don't want to show the other more sensitive information on their other side. So you completely lose this when you go down to one screen. The other thing is how taskbars are. So in Windows 10, your taskbar is just stretched along the screen. You can put it in different places, but there was no way to just put it like in the center. So this is me showing. So this is a screenshot from an ultra-wide display. So it goes all the way across, and there's still a lot in the corners of these displays. And the question is, where should the taskbar go? Does it stay at the bottom? Windows 11 is moving more towards what we would typically see with the Mac, but most people are just going to keep this at the bottom. If you have a very large gaze angle, what does that mean in terms of people, say, looking at the right for the time? And over an 8-hour course of a day, what does it mean for people's neck discomfort? So what are some things that we can do for organizing? Okay, so our take-home messages is that generally people like ultra-wide displays. There's a learning curve or maybe an upper limit on the size people will tolerate initially. Wider displays increase head rotation without a gaze angle change. So people still had the same level of gaze angle with more rotation, which could lead people into more awkward neck postures. So if the recommendations that are taken for dual displays are also applied here, you may need a higher monitor position if using the lateral areas of the displays frequently. A potential constraint could be desk depth, and this is not necessarily due to horizontal viewing distance, but rather larger stands that are being used. So you can artificially increase horizontal distance using a keyboard tray, but and maybe you guys have some other ways that you can talk about for that. And you should discuss with the user things like tasks that they're doing and functionality. So again, with our advisors who saw these changes in these monitors, they now have a hard time showing students data because they can't switch the monitor around because there is sensitive data for other students that is on there. So functionality and a discussion of whether you want to go from 2 monitors to 1. And with newer displays, and this is even for any display that is coming out, is to really watch out for brightness. If somebody is complaining, that you may have to look at the brightness of their display.
Hi,
Okay, thank you
Kaitlin.
very much. Yep.
I'm going to open it up for
Yep.
questions and leave your acknowledgement slide up there, and people can see more information on that when they access the slide deck. Excellent overview. I'm sure there's a lot of questions and they're coming up, so I'm going to jump to them now. And thank you. You were right on time with all of your content. Excellent. Matt's asking, he's curious to know whether there's any research regarding ratings of perceived or real measures of eye exertion between curved versus flat of equal size, even if the horizontal viewing distance is a minimal change and there is any significance with regards to fatigue.
Yeah, in the field that looked at the field study that we compared the 34 inches, they also installed 34-inch flat panels for individuals as well. And I can't remember, it's a proceedings from the Human Factors and Ergonomics Society meeting, Bartha 2020. And so they looked at both of them. There weren't huge differences between what people were looking at, how they perceived them, how they positioned them for the 34-inch flat panel, which would have the same area from there. But I cannot remember off the top of my head if things were the same, because it's so hard from a research perspective to get them both to match up. And that would be one of the only ways, but some of these larger flat panels aren't even being sold anymore. So that study would have been probably collected in 2018 from there. But that was one, and I can add some of the stuff there to compare what the 34-inch flat panel was showing as well. I can add that to the slides too, so that you can have that for reference.
Thanks, Kaitlin. I think you said the participant isn't sure, but is the height of the screen a problem with a very large screen? The top of the screen is potentially higher than the eyes, with a risk of more neck extension.
Yeah, and I think that may be why people went to a lower gaze angle, because even if you have to look up, like these are increasing in the height, and that may be why people are pushing them further away, but it also may be why people are choosing lower gaze angles because they're preferring to be in mild flexion rather than being in extension. Because if you line up the gaze angle at 0, or closer to 0, people are going to be looking up a lot more. So that could be one of the reasons that they choose a lower gaze angle for even as these displays start to increase, that they keep that consistent for there, because the vertical height is slightly increasing as well.
Okay. And if I set up the tasks of my monitor to have the main task in the center, ultra wide, would there be less overall rotation as compared to using dual displays? Logically, it makes sense, but has this been reviewed?
Yeah, so I think when in our original study that we looked at, if you're just looking at the center and you're looking at the center of a display, there shouldn't be that much different. And I think that's what we found for some of our original work is if people, especially with a primary in front of you and a secondary to the side, it's different if you're centered on them, but there's not much difference in the mean angle if most of your task is going to be on your primary right in front of you. That really doesn't change that much. It's when people need to use the lateral edges that we see changes. It's just, are people setting up their screen in a way that makes it easy to set up? Because on current Windows, there, unless you have a third party thing where you have, if you have a Dell monitor, they have it, but it's an extra thing that has to be installed. But HP, LG, Samsung make all of these as well, and it's less difficult, easy to find. But setting up that display in the center is a lot harder for an ultra wide display than it is for a dual display because those of how it is set up. So just for the center, you can set things up to be left and right fairly easily, but getting it nicely in the center is going to be a lot more difficult currently in an ultra wide display unless you have a window manager.
Okay. With all this great work, are there any general guidelines on how far and wide we should be positioning displays based on size, or are there too many display specs to account for?
So there are a lot, in terms of the number of specs that are coming out. And I have found, like, even especially on the newest monitor that we bought, that 40-inch one, there was a lot set on the default that we had to just turn off. And sometimes it would come back on without us even knowing. So there's that involved. They do all seem to have, if you're keeping the standard display um, stand, they all seem to have the same availability in terms of moving it around. But it seems like if you go to a larger display, people prefer to put it slightly more back, push it slightly further back. And so you would see that slight increase there. But that seems to be the only, everything else is fairly aligned in terms of what users prefer in coming in versus what we have found with all the different displays. It stays within the recommendations for what people would have. But that is only one of the main things that we will see is a slightly higher size, likely due to this height of the monitor rather than its width, is going to see just slightly moving it further back as they get bigger and bigger.
Did you find that there was any research related to fatigue based on a curved or flat screen
Yeah,
for the
and I
eye
guess
in particular?
so our dual display research, there was no difference in terms of what people found with fatigue, which meant people got fatigued no matter what the monitor potentially would be. So it was equal throughout, which may just be screen usage rather than the actual display itself. With our original study, we had people using those monitors for an hour and the eye discomfort was minimal in terms of what was coming up. Now that was a controlled environment without controlling for reflection, controlling for light. So it could be that there's, the other environmental factors play a huge thing, such as lighting and glare. And that the larger flat panels don't handle reflection as well in terms of how some of the reflection occurs on the outskirts. That's just from what I have seen in some of the work. So we always have to think about the other environmental factors. In that survey that I sent out, some people's biggest complaints were lighting. It had that was what they wanted to change in their office. So that's something that needs to be looked at.
Good point. Can the ultra-wide screens use a telescoping stand for easy height changes?
Yeah, and so you have to watch out when purchasing that it can handle the weight of the display. So from what I have seen in other from different companies, they will have their basic ones, and then they may call it like their Pro or their Max or something like that, that has a mechanism that allows for the larger display, because it's also the increased moment that is placed on it just because of how wide these displays are. So you don't have as many options from when we were doing this. It's a cumbersome install just because, I mean, these displays are wide and large, and so getting it, it's not as easy as it was for like your small flat panel displays, but they do exist. They definitely exist there. You just really have to make sure when you are purchasing that you look at the weight of the actual screen itself and make sure that the display arm, which means that many that you already have may not be able to work with the sizes. So that's something to look into if you're wanting to use ones that you already have.
Okay, I'm going to ask one more question. The questions you don't get to, we'll send to you, and maybe you can add them as an addendum to your slide deck.
Great.
Has there been some research done on mental fatigue and information overload when comparing two monitors versus one large monitor?
Ooh, I don't know. Um, there is definitely, from a cognitive ergonomic standpoint, people would have looked at monitoring information, which was one of the tasks that we had, that people had to manage stocks. But monitoring information is what we do a lot when we're collecting research um, data from there. So I don't know if there is any research in terms of fatigue, mental fatigue that may come from it, of whether it's one monitor, two monitor, or these tasks are fatiguing in general. I will say, as a person who has collected a lot of biomechanical data over 2 hours, and you're watching 16 muscle activity monitors, and you got a person's motion capture, is smaller. There is a fine line between having too big of a display where you're monitoring over such a large distance versus having a too small of a display where you can't do a good job at monitoring. You either can't have all of your windows up there. So while I don't know about the specific research, I think that is a very good question. And it may be like a lot of things where there's something in the middle in terms of area that needs to be scanned and how fatiguing it is and how good you are at doing it from a performance standpoint.
Thank you so much, Kaitlin, for your presentation today, and also for highlighting CRE-MSD seed grants, which we give out annually and these help organizations to carry out pilot research, such as the work you've referred to, and to look at the potential impact that organizations' processes might have on MSD prevention. So if anyone today has ideas or would like to investigate testing something out, please contact Bettina for further information about our seed grants. And I'd also ask people to join us on March 8th when our director Jack Callahan will be presenting the final theme webinar in remote work. The space between sitting and standing, hybrid seating, is the juice worth the squeeze? Thank you all so much for joining us today, and thank you again, Kaitlin, for an extremely informative webinar. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you.